Hello, my name is Dr. Eszter Simon. I work for Nottingham Trent University, and the title of my presentation is Arenas of Trust, President Carter's Use of the Moscow-Washington Hotline. What I'm doing here, I am currently trying to resuscitate an old paper and rework it for a publication. Currently, it feels like a footnote to a paper that I already published. It is too complex on the one hand. Although the empirics is interesting, I'm struggling to find the theoretical angle and the angle regarding trust. I'm thinking it's perhaps something about the interaction between various domains of trust, hence the title of the paper. But it may be that it is something about the unsuccessful innovation of a trust institution. So the Moscow-Washington hotline was a communication device between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War. And in a previous paper with my co-author, we hypothesized that the hotline is a device that provides decision makers with trust, where trust is a psychological state in which we expect no harm from another, despite being vulnerable to that person. The role of the hotline is basically to take a small area of interstate relations out of its distrustful nature and create sort of an island of trust for decision makers, so that when they start a crisis, and this is a crisis instrument, so that when they start a crisis, they can interact or start their interaction with some level of trust, not more than that each nation would like to prevent a nuclear holocaust. In other words, it is an instrument that helps decision makers to tilt crisis management towards mutually beneficial solutions and away from unilateral gains that may lead to nuclear war. We also hypothesized that there are certain scope conditions to this. So the hotline fulfills this, this trusting function if it is used when there is no interpersonal trust between leaders, which could otherwise solve the problem for them, or when leaders trust or have confidence in the hotline itself and its ability to work smoothly, but also to actually help them resolve crises. And then we hypothesized that decision makers are aware of how it should be used, and this involves four things. First, that it is a leader-to-leader line, so that only leaders should use, the US president and the Soviet leader, that meant different people in different time periods, general secretary, prime minister, or president. That it's a private channel, second. Third, then it is used in an emergency. So, and when we say in an emergency, we mean in a superpower or international crisis, in a situation in which both parties perceive a potential threat to Soviet-American relations, or in a situation in which there is a high risk of direct confrontation between the superpowers, or that they, and not necessarily unrelated to this one, they see that there is a threat to the survival of humanity, which requires urgent action. the last scope condition is that the hotline is used with cooperative intent. Now, when we are looking at President Carter's use, he used the hotline 6 times, more than any other Cold War presidents combined. So when we look at his use, we see that these scope conditions are not always met. When we look at scope conditions, what we can see is that 3 of them are quite unproblematic. It is that there was no interpersonal trust between leaders in any of the during any of the use. They both had confidence in the hotline, and it was only Brezhnev and Carter who used the hotline. Now, what we can also see that there are serious problems in the superpower emergency dimension. Basically, none of the crises qualified as a superpower emergency. We also see that in the last 2 crises where the hotline was used, at least Carter used it. Well, he used it privately, but he actually published the messages, which again called into question the private nature of the line, the private nature of the communication through the line, which had been respected during previous use. We also see some problems in terms of cooperative intent. There are several, especially early crises, where we see cooperative intent, but we don't see a lot of cooperative intent in early 1979 and from the later part of the same year. So besides seeing that some scope conditions were not met, what we also see is that, as we predicted in an earlier paper, although this is the first time we provide evidence for this, the hotline doesn't establish a thin layer of trust for decision makers to act upon. In the interstate dimension, the hotline doesn't help these leaders to reserve interstate conflict. They basically succeeded maybe in one case in Lebanon to have a common position, but it wasn't the result of negotiations or discussions via the hotline. It was the result of simply both of them having the same position on the issue from the first moment. In other words, there was no crisis, and that explains why basically there was no conflict and there was nothing to resolve. But we also see that because this trusting point of departure is no longer assumed, the hotline no longer behaves as a separate island of trust in the interstate dimension. What is somewhat unexpected, despite the fact that the hotline sort of mixes the interstate with the interpersonal. So it's an interpersonal link to try to find a solution to an interstate issue, distrust. But we can also see is that that the hotline communications between President Carter and Brezhnev follow and also influence the trust properties within the Carter-Brezhnev relationship. There, what we can see is that in 76-77, there is a bit of advanced trust coming from probably Brezhnev's positive experience with Nixon and Carter. Then we see deterioration of the relationship, so that it is rather distrustful by early 79. The summit of 1979, which took place during June, improve the relationship somewhat, at least convinces Brezhnev of Carter's trustworthiness. It is positive for Carter as well, except Brezhnev seems very old and senile. So there are problems in the ability dimension, but the relationship improves. And then what we can see is that the last nail in the coffin of the personal relationship is the Cuban brigade issue, which is over a brigade that was left in Cuba because at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And now Carter demands its removal, saying that it shouldn't be there. The Soviets are very angry, including Brezhnev. He's very irritated, and they think that Carter is just creating a crisis for domestic political reasons, which was part of the story. The other was a problem with institutional memory. They did no longer remember that brigade was part of the Missile Crisis Agreement. But after this, the relationship that deteriorates to the point that they are just repeating, at least Carter repeats only what he says publicly. The relationship is distrustful, and to be honest, it breaks down because Carter's message on the crisis in Poland is not even answered by Brezhnev. So what we can see is that while it doesn't do so the hotline doesn't do what it does when scope conditions are met, it does something somehow throwing conflict management in terms of to the interpersonal dimension, moving it a little bit away from the interstate dimension. And they are not necessarily negotiating on the basis of distrust automatically, but the starting point reflects the state of their personal relationship. Now, to finish, problems are that in the past I used symbolic interactionist role theory as a theoretical background. I'm not sure this is going to work here. But there is a theoretical dimension that is missing, as trust is not really a theory, at least not for IR and foreign policy analysis, which is my closer field. And again, although I said I'm looking at Carter's use of the hotline, it is still unclear whose behavior I'm explaining, Brezhnev's, Carter's, or both.